What's up guys, and welcome to my first comparison video using my new 2006 Porsche 987.1 Cayman S. As I mentioned in a previous video, I co-own this car with my friend James, and I'll be using this car to serve as the benchmark in the sub $30,000 range for pure driver's cars. And today we will be comparing this against a very natural rival from the same brand, the 987.2 base Cayman. In recent years, the two cars have become very close in price, and as of right now, around $30,000 will get you a clean example of either. So the 987.1 Cayman S is powered by an M97 engine, which is a 3.4 liter naturally aspirated flat six, making 295 horsepower, 251 pound-feet of torque. Of course, the reason the prices of these cars have stayed relatively low is because they have a number of known engine issues. They have an intermediate shaft or an IMS, and the bearing for that IMS is prone to failure, which will grenade the entire engine. Although on these M97 engines, it's really a very low risk of that happening. That said, there still is a significant risk of bore scoring in these engines, and if you track these cars, oil starvation becomes a pretty significant problem. But as a street car and a canyon car, these cars are actually pretty reliable as long as you do frequent oil changes, you warm them up properly, and you drive them frequently enough. These engines typically won't give you many problems at all. So as a street and canyon car, what are the differences in driving dynamics between this and the newer 2010 987.2 base Cayman, which has a completely different engine, the 9A1, which gets rid of the IMS. It has a completely different oiling system, much less prone to oil starvation. But that car has a smaller engine, 2.9 liters, 265 horsepower, so 30 horsepower down. It does have a slightly updated interior, front and rear bumpers, but which one is the better bang for your buck if you're planning to keep it off the racetrack? That's what we're going to find out. So this car isn't completely stock. The only mod that James and I have done is a set of Apex SM10 wheels, Falcon RT 660s, more than grippy enough for canyon driving. The base Cayman we're comparing this to, owned by Mahesh, is completely stock, even down to the Pilot Sport 2 tires. This car weighs a touch over 2,900 pounds. This does not have Porsche Active Suspension Management or PASM. Let's go for a little drive. McPherson strut suspension, front and rear. Not the most sophisticated suspension geometry for a sports car. We also have a top gear valved exhaust. Super aggressive sounding with the valve open, but one press of a button on a remote and it basically sounds as quiet as stock. So easy to heel toe. Love the feeling of a Porsche clutch. Not so much the manual itself. The shifter feel is really floppy from the factory. Even the shift cables are known to snap. Brake feel could be better as well. We're just on stock pads. There's a really nice solid feeling to the brake pedal, but it requires a lot of travel. There's very little initial bite. That is one area that we hopefully will address soon. Love this hydraulic steering rack. The first and last generation of Cayman to have this. And it's just full of feedback. It's close to perfect. I would say the steering ratio might be a little slow for my liking, but it definitely beats out any 981 or 718 steering rack in terms of feedback. 7,200 RPM redline. It pulls so linearly and smoothly. You hear that engine right behind you whizzing and whirring away. It's a very buzzy little engine. response is really good. Even though it's drive-by-wire, it's very direct. What a great car. There's a reason this is still one of my favorite driver's cars for sub $30,000. It just offers such a great blend. Performance, fun, rawness, and there's even a decent level of daily drivability. I daily drove my old one for about a year, and my main complaints were the McPherson strut, suspension, a little bit harsh for my liking, and there's quite a bit of tire noise. But outside of those two things, this car is a pretty decent daily driver. See right there, it just didn't handle that bump with a lot of poise. The suspension limitations, you can definitely feel on a canyon road. So much traction though. The combination of mid-engine and a sticky tire means that even though this car doesn't have a limited slip differential, is a very rare option for the 987, it still has tons of grip exiting corners. You won't be doing big smoky drifts or power slides in this car, but that's not really what the Cayman was ever about to begin with. So the lack of an LSD actually doesn't bother me that much. On track, maybe I'd want one, but out here in the canyons, sticky tires get the job done. Really sharp front end. Feels really good on the downhill because it's so light, sub 3,000 pounds. Just wish the brakes had a little bit more bite. Oh yes. Listen to that flat six just howling away. Those aggressive downshifts. It sounds so good. All for $30,000. I mean, we paid 25 grand for this car with 58,000 miles. How can the 987.2 be better than that with 30 less horsepower? That's what I want to know. Because people are still paying more for the 987.2. Is it really just down to the improvements in engine reliability? Or is there more to it than that? I will say the gearing is a little bit long. Second gear, third gear could be a bit shorter given the somewhat modest power level of this engine. But thankfully there's enough mid-range torque. You can really use this engine anywhere from 3,000 RPM and up. It's not a peaky engine. Very linear and smooth throughout the rev range. Fast car by modern standards, but it's just quick enough. 300 horsepower more or less and just under 3,000 pounds. Can't complain with that power to weight ratio. But in terms of the weaknesses of this car, again, the suspension, the shifter is loose and floppy. We definitely want to upgrade that. Some brake pads would be a simple but effective mod as well. And that might just be it. I don't know what else this car really needs. But would it be better to just scratch all that and just get a 987.2 base Cayman to begin with for more or less the same money? Let's find out. All right, so that brings us to the 2010 987.2 base Cayman. As I mentioned, this is powered by a 2.9 liter naturally aspirated flat six, making only 265 horsepower. But since this is the new 9A1 engine, we have a greatly improved oiling system. Oil starvation is basically a thing of the past. No more IMS bearing. And because this is the base model, we do still have port fuel injection. If you went for the S or any of the larger engines of this 9A1 family, you're stuck with direct injection. So Mahesh, the owner, has only done one mod, the Porsche OEM short shift kit. A few words on the interior, mostly the same, but it's been improved in a couple of key ways. This steering wheel is vastly improved over the base 987.1 wheel, much thicker rim, much more modern design, still no buttons on the wheel, which I like. And the center console is vastly improved as well. They have used a much better paint on these temperature and fan switches, and the overall button design just looks a bit more modern. We also have an updated front and rear bumper. Taillights do look a lot more sculpted compared to the .1, but to the average person and to the untrained eye, these two cars look virtually identical. You really have to know your nuances between Porsche generations to tell the difference. So that just leaves us with one question: which one is better to drive? Now, one thing I'm noticing right away, this is now a much quieter car, even at idle. But let's see how it sounds at wide open throttle close to redline. By the way, pro tip for you 987 Cayman owners, actually I think this applies to 981 owners as well, sagging headliners have been a widespread problem in these cars. And instead of replacing the entire thing when it starts to sag, Mahesh shared with me that he used a $10 product on Amazon, these little push pins. Basically just stuck it through the fabric and it keeps it more or less looking fresh. Still have this glorious hydraulic steering rack. Feels more or less the same as the .1. But definitely I'm noticing much less torque with this engine. There is just no replacement for displacement. See, we can't even get into fourth gear on this stretch of road. Chassis feels more or less the same. Steering feel, suspension, even the brakes. The car has the same strengths and the same deficiencies. Suspension could be better sorted, and the way it handles bumps is less than ideal. But the main difference here is the engine. Make no mistake about it. 2.9 liters versus 3.4, that's a half a liter difference. This engine might be just a tad more rev happy, but in the mid-range there's a noticeable disadvantage in torque. Let's demonstrate that here. First gear. Above 5,000 RPM, there's still pretty good power, and it'll rev out just a little bit higher than my car. But on a canyon road, because this has the same long gearing, I just find myself outside of the power band more often with this car. Really have to try hard to keep the revs high. Above 5,000 is the sweet spot here. And similar to what I said earlier about the idle sound of this engine being a lot quieter, that also applies when we're pushing it to redline, wide open throttle. This engine is much quieter than the 3.4 liter M97. It has a more refined sound. So if that's what you want, if you're going to daily drive this car and you want that low level of NVH, then this gives that to you, but at the expense of that aggressive intake sound that you might want from your Porsche. Still plenty of traction, even with just Pilot Sport 2. Also, I think the throttle response of this might be slightly dull compared to the 987.1S. I'm noticing that when I blip the throttle for a downshift, I have to blip it just a little bit harder. This also doesn't have Sport Chrono, so that's apples to apples with my car. Must come down to either the way this engine is tuned or perhaps the difference with the throttle mapping from the factory. So overall, the 987.2 base Cayman is a little bit less raw and perhaps less edgy than the 987.1S. A significant disadvantage in power and especially mid-range torque, and slightly duller throttle response. Outside of those few things, these cars feel virtually identical. And I'm surprised to be saying this, but I think that for a canyon car, for a car that you just want to have fun with and not necessarily drive every day, the 987.1S is still the more exciting Cayman experience for your roughly $30,000. But if your priority is refinement, and you don't want to pony up for the far more refined 981 generation Cayman, the 987.2 base really does do a good job at improving upon some of the rougher edges of the 987.1. Again, the buzzy and somewhat rough engine sound, and of course the interior. Horsepower might not sound like a huge difference, but when you're talking 295 versus 265, that's literally 10%. That is not an insignificant percentage. When I go back in time and choose a 987.2 base, if I were to track my Cayman, I think I would actually just pony up for the 987.2S. You get the reliability of the newer engine and you get more power. So that puts the 987.2 in an interesting spot. I think this car makes a lot of sense if you just want to have fun in the canyons and have a reasonably refined daily driver purely as a canyon car. The 987.1S offers a really good blend of that rawness and the performance that you come to expect. Let me know how you think these two generations compare. Which one would you be more willing to spend your $30,000 on? A big thank you to Mahesh for letting me drive his 987.2. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.